Hello viewer, the Nameless Scholar here. Sorry for the clickbait title. Actually, I regret nothing. I had to get your attention somehow. What if I told you that modern Warhammer 40k is just Age of Sigmar in space but worse? And that I fell into a rabbit hole where I realized that Games Workshop actually wanted to finish 40k a la End Times. In this lore video, well, not a lore video, but anyways, I mentioned that the reason why nothing becomes of anything in the modern lore is that GW is establishing things to turn Warhammer 40k into Age of Sigmar in space. Instead of doing it like how they did it with fantasy, they are using the boiling frog effect to do so. I always knew that GW wanted to kill off 40k like they did with fantasy, but they saw the backlash the End Times got, so they decided to put more subtlety to it. So their plans of ending 40k never went away. Some of my points came from a commenter of mine by the name of Life of Squidman, so thank you. While I was at work, an epiphany came to me and I wrote down literally everything I could think of. Prepare for a conspiracy theory as I explore the End Times that never was. Firstly, the calm before the storm was the wrath of Magnus. Then, with no pun intended, the gathering storm was to be the catalyst of the End Times with the fall of Cadia. I remember back in 2017, 2018, half the fanbase was concerned that the End Times were upon 40k, and the other half gaslit themselves, and half the fanbase into denial because the End Times was that traumatizing. Half of the fanbase was onto something. I just couldn't see it until now as of writing and recording this script. The first faction they would axe would be the faction they looked down upon with complete and utter contempt. Of course I'm talking about the Eldar. Eldrad Ulfraz's ritual to summon Iniad would still be disrupted by the Death Watch, leading Iniad to be summoned at a weaker state. After this, the Craft World Eldar would start getting decimated on all fronts by Slaanesh demons and the Emperor's children. Here is where we would see characters like Uriel, Asurman, Baharov, and the like die. While this is happening, Kane's Gate in Komara would have been breached, and this would spell the beginning of the end for the Dark Eldar. Drazar would have been slain by Jane Zar. The Harlequins would be annihilated by the Thousand Sons, led by Azhek Ahriman, and in a very poor taste way, just as he found the cure for the rubric, he and half the Legion gets obliterated either by Chegorak or whatever creatures that inhabit the Black Library. Essentially, the cure dies with him. Psychic Awakening Phoenix Rising hinted at what would have happened to the Eldar if GW decided to go through with a 40k The End Times. As a final insult from Games Workshop to Eldar fans, Ivrain and the Inari would search everywhere for the Crone Swords, while saving as much Dark Eldar who wish to change their ways as they can. Then they would be at Komara, where Shalaxi Hellbane would kill Jane Zar and Lilith Hesperax. Then Shalaxi would explain that the last Crone Sword is in the Palace of Pleasure, and also kill Ivrain, the Visarch, and a Solitaire, essentially making the Inari's efforts doomed from the start. Komara would be overrun with demons, and this way they would permanently get rid of the Dark Eldar range that they didn't want, such as Osdrubal Vect, the Cabals, as well as Urien Rakarth and the Homunculi Covens. This is why Vect's model was removed from the game in 8th edition. The last Eldar to fall would have been Fuegan, where he would make his last stand. When he would fall in battle, the Eldar species would have been extinct, and that would empower Iniad to become a true god, starting the Ranadandra. This is why the Inari plotline has been so stagnant ever since 2019. It's not because the Inari books didn't sell well. It's all a ruse. GW never intended to write a third Inari novel. It was never in the plans! Meanwhile, the Silent King's return would mean that the Tyranids are finally moving towards Holy Terra and devouring everything in their way. To combat the Tyranids, the Silent King would awaken every Tomb World simultaneously. And here's where it gets dumb. Meanwhile, on Octarius, the Tyranids and the Orks were waging an all-out war a la Pacific Rim. So what if, give me a moment, I'm putting on my tinfoil hat. The Tyranid hive mind and the Wa energy merged into one. This would explain the beast nagas added into the range and why they look so primal and gorkish. I wouldn't be surprised if GW reworked, say, the Death Skulls into 40k's equivalent of the Cruel Boys. But wait! It gets dumber! After the Eldar have either been consumed by Slaanesh, or have their souls used to empower Iliad, then GW, against all common sense and lore, despite the Eldar and the Necrons being ancient enemies, would essentially go, oh, Chaos and the Tyranids are the greater enemy, and would make an alliance, and in that way, you would have Warhammer 50k's equivalent of Grand Alliance death. Iliad and the Silent King would essentially share the role of Nagash. How would that work? I don't know. I think I'm not as stupid as GW think that... Well, at least, I don't think I'm stupid enough to actually go through with this. As to how the Iliad would preserve the Necrons and vice versa, I don't know. But I know it would happen. And a lot of the named Eldar characters and some of the named Necron characters would essentially be Age of Sigmar's equivalent of the Mortarks. The T'au would fall due to two reasons. First of them being that Commander Farsight would start the T'au's equivalent of the Horus Heresy. The second being that the Eastern Fringe would very likely get overrun by the Tyranids. However, the fate of the T'au is linked to the fate of the Imperium. The Imperium would have been getting decimated on all fronts by Chaos, Necrons, the Orks, and the Tyranids. Meanwhile, the Primarchs would be returning at a much faster pace than they are now. The first Primarch to return is Magnus the Red with the Wrath of Magnus, then Mortarion shortly after the fall of Cadia, then the Inari, with Belisarius' skull, would resurrect Roboute Guilliman. The T'au's remnants, against all common sense and lore, would make an uneasy alliance with the Imperium, and that's how the Primaris Space Marines would have been actually introduced, and the Imperium plus T'au would form the foundation for 50k's equivalent of Grand Alliance Order. Cole, using T'au technology, would create the Mark X armor, and that's how the Primaris were originally supposed to be introduced. Roboute, while fighting Magnus, would be saved by Cypher, under the condition that Roboute takes him to Holy Terra to the Golden Throne. Guilliman agrees, and Cypher takes the sword found on his back to the Emperor, and would have been killed by the Adeptus Custodes. I believe that Cypher would essentially become the savior, or Christ of the Fallen. I will come back to this later. I believe Psychic Awakening Faith and Fury was where the Black Templars were supposed to die. In Blood of Baal, the Tyranids were to overrun Baal, and that's how the Blood Angels were to be destroyed. Either there or at some point later on in the story, Sanguinius partially returns as the Sanguinor. The Ritual of the Damned was meant to originally explain how the Grey Knights were destroyed by Magnus, and as their final act, Kaldor Drago would have been summoned, and he would decimate the other half of the Thousand Sons Legion. Then Kaldor Drago would return to the Warp, never to be mentioned again. The Greater Good would originally have explained in detail the downfall of the T'au, or at least plant the seeds of their downfall. I am more inclined to believe the former. As for Saga of the Beast, the reason why one of the box sets was called The Prophecy of the Wolf is that it could have been that this would have marked the return of Leman Russ, or more likely would be the catalyst for the return of Leman Russ. The Space Wolves would have been destroyed, or at least Logan Grimnar is killed by Gaskul Mag Uruk Thraka. Then later, Leman Russ returns, essentially the prophecy of the Wolf Time is fulfilled, and Leman, very likely, saves Isha, the Eldar goddess of healing and fertility, from Nurgle's Manor to resurrect the Emperor, likely sacrificing Isha and essentially getting rid of her, like they did with the Dark Eldar Cabals and the Homunculi Covens. Engine War was originally meant to tackle the beginning of the end for Imperial Knights and the Adeptus Mechanicus. War of the Spider was most likely originally intended to be a way to kill Fabius Bile, and Pariah was meant to establish the foundation of 40k's Grand Alliance death with Iniad and the Silent King. After this, Angron would return and kill Commissar Yarrick. This would also lead to the destruction of the Salamanders chapter, either leaving the prophecy regarding Vulcan's artifacts unfulfilled, or would set up to establish his return, probably the former. Then Lionel Johnson returns and reveals that he has forgiven the Fallen and will allow them to return to the fold without being executed. As we all know, because they got an index as of 10th edition, the next traitor Primarch to return will be Fulgrim. And mark my words, the next Loyalist Primarch to return will be Jaghatai Khan. Before I move on to speculation territory, I want to say that if this is to be believed, I think they are going to finally turn 40k into Age of Sigmar in space proper, even though I would have preferred the of mice and men treatment. Up to this moment, I am pretty certain as to what would have happened. The rest, however, are purely my speculation. So, here goes. I think Ultramar would have finally been overrun by the Tyranids in the 4th Tyrannic War. Savitar will finally return from his millennia-long exile, and Conrad Kurz will come back in the body of Zol Sahal, effectively proving that his crown had an Eldar Soul Stone which housed the soul to be correct. Rogaldorn will probably return when a second siege of Terra occurs. Same with Perturabo, who's a wildcard. Maybe GW reveals that Perturabo never became a Demon Prince, but rather is essentially a super dreadnought. Or he will come back as a Demon Prince. Alfarius is also a wildcard.
It could be you. It could be me. It could even be...
Same with Lorgar and Korax. I don't know what's going on with them. Sanguinius could only partially return as the Sanguinor. And if they bring them back, the Legion of the Damned could be led by the soul of Ferrus Manus. What I do know for certain is that the Tyranids will win. The second siege will have Chaos, Orks, and the Tyranids, and the Imperium will simply be overwhelmed, and then the galaxy is destroyed by Abaddon. Now, what would an actual Age of Sigmar in space look like? From now on, I will be referring to Age of Sigmar in space as Warhammer 50,000, Warhammer 50k, or simply 50k. I think here's how Grand Alliance order would be. The Primaris would have served their original purpose. Not to be true-scale Marines, but to be a full, proper replacement of the Space Marines and essentially be sci-fi Stormcast Eternals like they actually are. There would be cities of Sigmar equivalent with whatever remains with the Imperial Guard, Sisters of Battle and such. The Primarchs would be the Emperors, who, by the way, fully accepts the role of God now, generals and such. There would be the Custodes. There would be the Admech, now completely separate from the Imperium. There would be the T'au. There would also be the Leagues of Votan. I believe that they were always meant to be for 50k. It's why they have AI, and apparently technology on par with the Dark Age of technology. And finally, I believe that 2 of the Knife Years would be in Grand Alliance order. Lilith Hesperax and Eldrad Ulfran. Lilith Hesperax in 50k would essentially become the Morathi of Warhammer 50k, being the only person to escape Slaaneish's gullet. And I don't think Eldrad would simply just be a Mortarch-ish. I don't see that in Eldrad's character. I'll come back to him later. So, the reason why Lilith Hesperax gets leeway is because it's GW's attempt at sidelining Slaanesh, like they did with Age of Sigmar. So, in Age of Sigmar, Morathi tells the way she got out of Slaanesh's gullet, so she, Malarian/Malekith, and Teclis and Tyrion could extract the elf souls that she devoured. And with this, Morathi and Eldrad would essentially imprison Slaanesh with the aid of the Emperor Iniad and such, and imprison Slaanesh and sideline Slaanesh. Just pretend Slaanesh doesn't exist because Slaanesh doesn't sell. The reason for this is GW and a lot of the masses just simply see Slaanesh as the god of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And GW doesn't have the courage to take risks and explore the darker side of Slaanesh, like sculpting models with bare breasts. Example, Morathi's old model in fantasy. And yes, I am spineless enough to fear YouTube's wrath to show Morathi's old model. And not even Creative Assembly had the courage to do so. As in Total War Warhammer 2, instead of giving Morathi bare breasts like on her model, they went to Quentin Tarantino route and instead gave her bare feet. Now this would happen especially if, despite summoning Iniad, Eldrad also joined Grand Alliance Order. He would essentially be both the Tyrion and Teclis of 50k, and essentially establish the Lumineth Realm Lords in space. Grand Alliance Chaos would be the Chaos Space Marines and whatever stupid name GW is planning for them for their copyright, led by a Baron who's just Archeon but worse in every way. The Emperor's Children, World Leaders, Death Guard, and the Thousand Sons would in essence be 50k's equivalent of the Hedonites of Slaanesh, the Blades of Khorne, the Maggotkin of Nurgle, and the Disciples of Tzeentch. And to substitute the Skaven, I don't know, have the Night Lords, its Chaos faction or something, just destroy my favorite faction in 40k for no logical reason.
Logic is for pussies.
Grand Alliance death would be the Harlequins, whatever abomination Iniad turned the Eldar into, and the Necrons, who may or may not have new biological bodies. And Grand Alliance destruction is just Orks and The Tyranids. Maybe I'm just rambling like an incoherent madman. Maybe I know I am right. Whatever is the case, I would have much rather had GW kill 40k in its own end times and give us something like this, rather than to see it becoming the eldritch abomination that not even Tzeentch could have dreamed of that it is today.